A bell-collared German shepherd stood beside a lonely Navy SEAL's fence in the Wyoming snow. She did not bark, beg, or run. She simply waited for him to remember. Her name was Kestrel, and she carried the last small sound of a chapel the town was ready to forget. At the top of Juniper Ridge, an old winter road was about to be erased by polished promises and quiet paperwork. But Dean Holloway had once followed that chapel bell home through a blizzard, and he had never thanked the man who rang it. Now one faithful dog, one stubborn widow, and one wounded mechanic would have to teach a whole town how to listen again. Tell us where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep writing stories like this. Snow did not make Juniper Ridge look dead. It made the ridge look honest. By late afternoon, the whole valley below Dean Holloway's cabin had gone white and bright, clean enough to hurt the eyes. Sunlight broke across the snowfields in hard silver sheets. Fence posts rose from the drifts like old black stitches. The roofs of Pine Hollow far below looked small and careful, as if someone had set a toy town inside a glass globe and forgotten to shake it gently. Dean stood at his kitchen window with a chipped mug in one hand and no real interest in the coffee inside it. He was 54, tall enough that old door frames still tried to remind him of it, broad through the shoulders, and built less like a man who worked out than one who had spent half his life wrestling stubborn machinery in bad weather. His face was long, wind-cut, with a nose that had been broken once and never quite forgiven anyone for setting it. Hazel gray eyes watched the valley from beneath brows, touched with frost-colored age. His brown hair had gone ashy at the temples, and his short stubble showed more silver every winter. On the chair near the stove lay the shirt he had been wearing since morning, an old olive-drab combat shirt fitted through the body, with camouflage sleeves and faded horizontal bands at the upper arms. It was not a uniform anymore. Dean would have argued it never had been, not here. Here it was, just cloth that still held up under work, cold and silence. That was all a man needed from clothing. Most days, Dean needed even less from people. The cabin sat high on the slope above Juniper Ridge, Wyoming, where the road narrowed before bending toward the old pass. Dean had bought the place years ago when he still believed distance was a tool. If a man put enough snow, pine, and elevation between himself and the town, maybe the past would lose his address. The past, unfortunately, had better navigation than most tourists. There had been a time when every truck in the county seemed to find its way to Dean's old garage. Mail jeeps with frozen axles, ranch tractors that coughed smoke like dying dragons, ambulances that refused to start on mornings when refusing was not a moral option. County plows, generators, snowmobiles, anything with oil, bolts, belts, or a bad attitude. Dean Holloway could listen to an engine for 10 seconds and hear what part of it had begun lying. People used to trust him for that. Then one winter, the warning lights along the upper pass failed during a storm. Dean had argued with the county for weeks about money, parts, and whether a temporary repair was better than waiting for a proper one. He had walked away angry, the kind of angry that feels righteous until weather proves it useless. That night, a mountain nurse and a rancher lost their way near the old Bell Road. They survived. No funeral followed, no courtroom, no headline, only hours of searching, frostbitten fingers, a county report full of careful language, and a shame that found Dean's ribs and settled there like iron. Since then, he had fixed things for himself. Only for himself. The town had learned to stop asking. He took a sip of coffee, grimaced, and muttered, "Could strip paint with that." No one answered, which was one advantage of living alone. No one disagreed when he insulted his own cooking. Then came the sound. Small, bright, almost not there. Ling. Dean went still. He listened. Wind moved along the eaves. Somewhere behind the cabin, a pine branch shed snow with a soft collapse. The old refrigerator hummed in the corner like it had grievances. Ling! Dean lowered the mug. It came from outside, beyond the front fence, not the hard clank of a loose gate, not a cowbell from down valley. This was finer, more deliberate, a tiny bronze voice trying not to be swallowed by winter. Dean set the mug on the counter and pulled on his coat. Dark tobacco waxed canvas, stiff in the shoulders, scarred at the cuffs. He stepped onto the porch. Cold took his breath cleanly, without drama. The yard opened before him, white and sharp under the sinking sun. His fence line ran along the drifted slope, half buried where the wind had pushed snow against the rails. At the far post stood a German shepherd. She was tall, lean, and still, not starved, not wild, but narrow through the waist and long in the legs, built like something meant to move across distance without wasting itself. Her coat was the old black and gold pattern of the breed, but winter had softened the colors. Dark saddle across the back, honey gold flanks, cream at the chest, and a muzzle touched with gray around the chin and eyes. Her left ear stood clean and sharp. The right tipped outward slightly at the top, giving her a look of permanent listening. Around her neck was a worn brown leather collar. Tied to it with a strip of old cord hung a small tarnished bell. The dog stared at Dean. Dean stared back. "No," he said. The dog did not blink. "I don't know what you think this is," Dean told her, "but I'm not taking applications." The shepherd turned and began walking toward the old road. Dean watched her go. After 20 feet she stopped, looked over her shoulder, and waited. That was worse than barking. Barking gave a man permission to be annoyed. Waiting gave him time to realize he was being chosen for something he had not agreed to. Dean folded his arms. "Go home." The dog's bell moved in the wind. Ling. It was not loud enough to command him. That, somehow, made it harder to ignore. Dean looked toward the valley. Pine Hollow sat peaceful below, smoke rising from chimneys, windows beginning to glow gold. None of those houses needed him. They had made that clear by learning how to manage without him. He looked back at the dog. She took 3 more steps and stopped again. "You're pushy," Dean said. The shepherd's tail gave one slow movement. Not a wag, more like a verdict. Dean cursed under his breath, went back inside for gloves, then took his old walking stick from beside the door. He almost grabbed the small wooden-handled wrench from the hook near the stove, the one Arthur Mallory had given him long ago, after a night Dean preferred not to remember. His fingers touched it. Then he left it hanging. Some debts could wait another hour. The dog led him up the narrow road toward the pass. She did not run. She moved with the controlled pace of a creature accustomed to judging the strength of whoever followed. Every few yards she paused, checked Dean, then continued. Her pause made almost no sound on the packed snow. Only the bell marked her presence. Ling, ling, ling. Dean hated how familiar the road felt under the snow. Every bend had a memory hiding under it. Every ditch had a shape he knew by instinct. Pines leaned close on either side, their branches loaded with white. The sky was pale blue above the ridge, but shadows were already gathering in the low places, blue as old bruises. Soon the old chapel appeared. St. Anselm's sat near the shoulder of the pass, small and weathered, built of dark timber gone silver at the edges. A narrow steeple rose from the roof, and inside it hung the bell that had once carried across the ridge in storms. The chapel had never been grand. It looked less like a church than a stubborn hand raised against winter. A woman stood near the steps, attacking a drift with a bent shovel. She was small, thin, and wrapped in a faded cranberry-red coat that made her look like the only warm mark on the white hillside. Her silver hair was pinned low beneath a wool hat, though several strands had escaped and were being punished by the wind. She stopped shoveling when she saw the dog. "Kestrel," she said. The shepherd went to her at once, not leaping, not whining, but pressing her shoulder gently against the woman's knee. The woman closed one gloved hand over the dog's collar. For a moment her face changed. The sharpness stayed, but something beneath it trembled. Then she looked at Dean. "Well," she said, "took her long enough." Dean stopped at the foot of the steps. "You know this dog?" "I know that dog better than I know half the people who still send me Christmas cards with their names printed inside." She planted the shovel in the snow. "Vera Mallory." "I know who you are." Most men say that when they don't want to admit they should have visited sooner. Dean almost turned around. Kestrel looked at him. That was becoming a problem. Vera Mallory had been the winter mail carrier on Juniper Ridge for decades. Dean remembered her old postal truck. Blue-white, dented, chains always rattling, heater probably held together by prayer and illegal wiring. She had delivered letters, prescriptions, pension checks, bad news, good news. And once, according to local legend, a birthday cake that arrived with only one side collapsed. Her husband, Arthur, had kept the bell at St. Anselm's. Dean remembered Arthur too well. Tall, patient, hands like fence rails, voice gentle enough to make a blizzard feel briefly embarrassed. Kestrel had belonged to him. Dean looked down at the shepherd. "She came to my fence." "Of course she did." "You say that like it makes sense." Vera's mouth twitched. "Dogs are irritating that way. They often make sense before people do." Dean looked at the chapel, then at the bell tower. "Why would she bring me here?" The wind moved between them. For the first time, Vera looked older. Not weak, never weak, but worn in the way a rope is worn when it has held too much weight and refuses to snap. "Because Arthur is gone," she said, "and because somebody is trying to make this place disappear politely." Dean said nothing. Vera turned toward the chapel. "Coulter Wynne bought the parcels below the pass. He wants a closed winter resort. Private road, private ridge, private view, private everything, because apparently snow becomes more valuable when ordinary people are kept off it." Dean knew the name. Everyone did. Wynne had been in the county paper twice that month, smiling beside drawings of expensive cabins and glass-front lodges. A man with clean gloves and cleaner words. "What's that got to do with St. Anselm's?" Dean asked, though he already disliked the answer forming in his head. "If Bell Road stays public, his resort road has to stay open to locals. Emergency access, winter passage, historical use. All those ugly little phrases that make rich men reach for lawyers." "Bias." Dean looked toward the old road stretching beyond the chapel, half hidden under wind-packed snow. Vera continued. "He's pushing the county to declare the road unsafe and the chapel functionally obsolete. Says the bell is sentimental. Says the tower is a liability. Says we can preserve the memory with a plaque." "A plaque," Dean repeated. "A little bronze apology screwed to a stone," Vera said. "Very tasteful, very dead." Kestrel's bell stirred in the wind. Ling. Dean felt the sound move somewhere under his ribs. He had heard another bell on this ridge once, not small like this one, not close. The great bell of St. Anselm's had rolled through a whiteout with a voice deep enough to make snow seem to listen. Dean had been younger then, proud and half-frozen, his truck dead near the north ditch, his sense of direction gone, his hands numb inside gloves that had not been good enough. He had followed the sound because there had been nothing else to follow. Then Arthur Mallory had found him near the chapel road, half upright and lying to himself about how much trouble he was in. Arthur had said very little. He wrapped Dean in a blanket, brought him inside, poured black coffee into a tin cup, and put a young German shepherd near the door to watch him. That shepherd had stared with amber eyes. Dean looked down now. Kestrel stared back. Older, grayer, still listening. Dean swallowed once and hated that Vera seemed to notice. "I'm not your man for this," he said. Vera picked up her shovel again. "No?" No, I fix machines. You used to fix roads too, in your own unpleasant way. I said machines. And what do you think a bell tower is, Mr. Holloway? It's wood, rope, iron, weather, and stubbornness. Sounds like half the junk you used to resurrect before breakfast. Dean's jaw tightened. Whatever Wynne is doing, it's county business. Everything is county business until it becomes nobody's business. Below them, the old road glowed in the cold light. Snow lay over it smooth and bright, as though no wheel, boot, hoof, stretcher, mail truck, plow, or frightened man had ever passed that way. Dean wanted to believe that. It would have made leaving easier. Kestrel stepped away from Vera and came to Dean. She stopped beside his right boot. The little bell on her collar hung still now. Silent, waiting. Dean looked from the dog to the chapel, from the chapel to Vera, from Vera to the empty white road. I should go, he said. Vera nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. Most people do. That was unfair. Worse, it was accurate. Dean turned toward the road home. He took 3 steps before the wind shifted through the steeple. Somewhere above, the old bell moved on its yoke, not enough to ring fully. Just enough to give one low, hollow breath of metal. Not a call. Not yet. Dean stopped. Behind him, Kestrel's small collar bell answered. Ling. And there, in the space between the 2 sounds, the past found him with perfect aim. Arthur's hands around a tin cup, snow melting from Dean's sleeves, a young dog by the door. A great bell swinging above them, telling the mountain that one more fool had made it through the night. Dean did not turn around, but his voice came out lower than before. What exactly is Wynne trying to file? Vera did not answer quickly. She was too wise for triumph. At last she said, A petition to close the Winter Passage Review before the county can confirm historical access. Dean looked back. Kestrel stood between him and Vera, her amber eyes steady, her black and gold coat bright against the snow. Dean sighed through his nose. Fine, he said. I'll look at the tower. That's all. Vera's smile was small, crooked, and dangerous. Of course, she said. That's how most roads begin. One man pretending he's only taking one step. Kestrel turned toward the chapel door. Her bell rang once more, and Dean Holloway, who had spent years making a religion of staying away, followed. Dean had meant to look at the tower. That was all. A man could examine rope, pulleys, wood rot, and iron brackets without adopting a cause. He could tell an old woman whether her bell tower was about to kill somebody, and then return to his own house before the coffee in his mug grew a skin. That was a reasonable plan. Unfortunately, Vera Mallory did not seem built by reasonable plans. She unlocked the side door of St. Anselm's with a key worn bright at the teeth and pushed her shoulder against the swollen wood. The chapel opened with a groan, letting out a breath of coal dust, old pine, and the faint dry smell of hymnals no one had sung from in years. Kestrel slipped in first. Dean followed last because pride enjoyed pretending it had choices. The chapel was smaller inside than he remembered. 2 rows of narrow pews, a little stove in the corner, windows clouded at the edges by frost, and a pulpit plain enough to shame a man out of lying. The bell rope hung near the back wall, thick and faded, its lower end wrapped in old leather where too many hands had pulled it through too many storms. Vera did not stop in the sanctuary. She led him through a narrow door behind the pulpit, into a back room that seemed to have been designed by someone who believed storage was a spiritual discipline. Boxes leaned against other boxes. Rolled maps sat in an umbrella stand. Shelves held ledgers, coffee tins full of screws, 2 cracked lanterns, a coil of rope, a stack of weather journals, and framed photographs turned face in to protect them from sunlight that no longer reached the room properly. There, Vera said. Dean looked around. There what? The treasure. He gave her a flat look. Vera's mouth twitched. "Relax, Mr. Holloway. No gold, no secret will, no dramatic letter from a dead man confessing he owned half the county. Just paper, which is less exciting until someone tries to take your road." She pulled a ledger from a shelf and set it on a small table under the window. Dust rose in a gray sigh. Kestrel lay down beside the table as if she had attended such meetings before and found humans slow but occasionally useful. Vera opened the ledger. Inside were dates, weather notes, names, times, and short lines written in a careful hand. "Arthur's Bell Book," she said. Dean did not touch it. His eyes caught one entry near the top of the page. December 18th. North wind. White out by 3. Bell rung 4:10 to 7:25. Mail truck through. Harlan feed delivery through. Nurse Dawes through. One fool in a green pickup found near ditch. Dean looked away before Vera could see too much. She saw anyway. "Arthur kept records," she said. "Not because he loved paperwork. He hated paperwork. Said forms were what men invented when they didn't trust handshakes anymore. But he knew memory gets called sentimental when money enters the room." Dean moved to the shelves and lifted a rolled map. The paper cracked softly at the edge. "Bell Road," Vera said. "That's what folks called it. Not official enough for men in polished shoes, maybe, but official enough when a storm took the horizon." The map showed the chapel at the crest of the pass, then a winter route bending along the ridge before dropping toward Pine Hollow. Several points had been marked with pencil: Old Fence Line, North Ditch, Miller Draw, Stone Culvert, Mail Turn. Dean had driven all of it once, repaired half the engines that crossed it, cursed every drift along it. He had also pretended for years that roads could forget who used them. Vera turned pages in the ledger. Bells were not romance up here. They were direction. In a whiteout, sound carries where sight quits. Mail carriers used it, nurses used it, ranchers used it, delivery men used it, people going down for medicine, people coming home before dark. Arthur rang that bell when weather ate the road. Dean studied the tower through the back window. "And wind says none of that matters." "Wind says it matters beautifully," Vera said. "That is worse." Dean glanced back. "He says street. Anselm's is part of local heritage," she continued. "He says heritage should be preserved responsibly. He says the bell tower is unstable, the winter passage is unsafe, and the county should close the access review before liability becomes an issue." That sounds like lawyer talk. It is lawyer talk, wearing a clean scarf? Dean almost smiled. Almost. Vera pulled another folder from the pile. "He hired a private engineer. Report says the steeple has structural deterioration, which it does. Says the road lacks modern safety markers, which it does. Says community bell ringing is a sentimental practice with no documented operational function." Dean felt something in his jaw tighten. Documented? That is the word they use when they want to make living people feel like rumors. The chapel creaked around them. Outside, snow slid from the roof in a soft, heavy sheet. Dean closed the map carefully. "If the tower is rotten, he has a point." Vera nodded. "Yes." That surprised him. She looked at the ceiling, not angry now, only tired. "I am not fighting to pretend old wood is new. I am fighting because he wants the county to say the road never mattered, the bell never functioned, and the people who remember it are just decorating winter with feelings." Dean did not answer. There were arguments a man could win and still feel smaller afterward. A vehicle crunched into the chapel yard. Kestrel lifted her head. Dean turned toward the front room as a woman stepped into the chapel without knocking. She wore a dark brown sheriff's department parka dusted with snow, black tactical pants, and boots that had seen enough county mud to distrust clean floors. Her hair, chestnut brown, was tucked beneath a black knit cap, and a radio sat clipped at her shoulder. She had the steady, economical face of someone who had broken up family arguments, written death notifications, pulled drunk hunters out of ditches, and learned not to waste expression. "Vera," she said. "Deputy Kent," Vera replied. "You're tracking snow on holy ground." "This floor has survived 70 years of ranch boots. It can survive me." The deputy's eyes moved to Dean, not startled, not impressed, just registering. "Dean Holloway?" "Maris Kent," Vera said, though both of them already knew it. "She has the misfortune of believing in procedure." Maris stepped farther inside. "Procedure is what keeps your friends from turning your grudges into lawsuits." "I prefer grudges with good handwriting," Vera said. Dean looked between them. "Should I leave?" "No," Maris said. "Yes," Vera said at the same time. Kestrel exhaled through her nose. Maris glanced at the dog. "Arthur's shepherd?" "Kestrel," Vera said. The deputy's face softened by a degree so small most people would have missed it. Kestrel did not. Her tail moved once against the floor. Maris removed a folded paper from inside her coat and set it on the table. "County received Wynn's preliminary petition this morning. Nothing final yet, but he's pushing for the winter passage review to be closed on safety grounds." Vera did not touch the paper. "Safety, that noble word." "It's a real word," Maris said, "and he is using real weaknesses. The tower needs inspection. The road markers are inconsistent. The county records are incomplete. If this goes before the board as memory versus liability, liability wins before anyone finishes their coffee." Dean leaned against the table. "So what does she need?" Maris looked at him, and for the first time there was a question under her professional calm. "Proof," she said. "Not speeches, not nostalgia. Proof of public use, proof of county recognition, maintenance records, medical or postal reliance, prior maps, weather logs. Anything showing Bell Road wasn't just a local habit, but a functional winter access route." Vera looked at Arthur's ledger. Dean saw the old woman's hand close, not quite into a fist. For a second, the room felt less like a storage closet and more like a courtroom where the dead had been called to testify, but no one had given them chairs. Then Vera said, "Harriet." Maris sighed. "That would be my guess." Dean looked at them. "Harriet who?" "Harriet Sloan," Vera said. "Former county records clerk, current librarian, permanent terror of misfiled documents." Maris folded her arms. "She worked county archives before they digitized half the system and lost track of the other half. If an old maintenance record exists, Harriet may know which basement mouse has been sleeping on it." Dean straightened. "Then go ask her." Vera looked at him. It was not a gentle look. "You came this far," she said. "Don't start pretending your boots belong to someone else." "They." Dean wanted to tell her she had mistaken a reluctant inspection for citizenship, but Kestrel rose, walked to the chapel door, and waited beside it. Not pulling, not ringing, just waiting. Dean stared at her. "You do that a lot." Vera gathered the ledger and 2 folders into a worn leather mailbag. She learned from Arthur. He also waited until people ran out of excuses. Maris checked her watch. "Library closes at 5. "Harriet closes when Harriet decides the public has become unworthy," Vera said. "Move." The Pine Hollow Library sat between the post office and a bakery that smelled like cinnamon even when closed, which Dean considered unfair warfare. The building was brick, squat, and worm-lit, with a carved wooden sign showing a pine branch over an open book. Snow had been swept from the steps with military precision. Inside, heat wrapped around Dean's face so quickly his eyes watered. The library smelled of paper, radiator steam, old carpet, and lemon polish. A few patrons murmured near the front desk. Somewhere in the children's section, a heater clicked like a beetle. Dean stayed near the door longer than necessary. Public places had a way of recognizing absences. A woman behind the desk looked up over the top of burgundy-framed glasses. She had a round, composed face, short salt and pepper hair clipped with a little pine-cone barrette, and a cardigan the color of moss after rain. A pencil rested behind one ear. Another, red, was stuck through the bun at the back of her head, as if she expected paperwork to attack from multiple directions. "Vera Mallory," she said, "if you've brought me another box of damp church records, I'm going to make you pray over them first." Vera set the mailbag on the counter. "Good afternoon, Harriet." "That means yes." Maris stepped forward. "Harriet, we need help establishing Bell Road's county status." Harriet's eyes moved to Maris, then to Dean, then down to Kestrel, who had entered with the grave dignity of a visiting official. "Well," Harriet said, "that explains the dog. People only bring witnesses with fur when the paper ones have gone missing." Dean found himself liking her despite immediate caution. Harriet came around the desk and led them to a side room marked Local History. Inside were file cabinets, flat map drawers, a microfilm machine, and shelves of binders labeled with years. The room looked harmless in the way snowdrifts looked harmless before swallowing a truck. Vera explained Wynn's petition. Harriet listened without interrupting. That was worse than asking questions. She took in every sentence the way Dean took in an engine sound, not admiring it, diagnosing it. When Vera finished, Harriet said, "A town does not win against lawyers by weeping attractively." Vera gave Dean a look as if to say, "See?" Harriet continued, "It wins with minutes, signatures, appropriations, right-of-way language, maintenance invoices, and somebody stubborn enough to read the small print after supper." Dean looked at the file cabinets. "You think that exists?" "I think men in offices have been mislabeling important things since Moses came down with tablets, and someone asked whether they had been properly stamped." Maris coughed once. It might have been a laugh in uniform. Harriet opened a drawer and began pulling index cards. "Bell Road may not be under that name. Try St. Anselm Winter Route, Ridge Access, Chapel Pass, Mail Grade, Upper Emergency Road. Old records are like old men. They answer to the wrong name just to be difficult." Dean said, "I heard that." "Good," Harriet replied. "Then help." So he did, not gladly, not nobly. But he took a box from a lower shelf when Harriet pointed at it. He carried map drawers to the table. He held brittle pages flat while Vera read dates aloud. Maris photographed labels and wrote notes in a black field book held shut with a red elastic band. Kestrel lay under the table, her bell silent against her collar, her eyes half closed but aware of every footstep. An hour passed. Then another. Dean learned that paper aged differently from people. Some yellowed, some curled, some held ink so sharply it seemed yesterday had only stepped into the hall. They found references to snow closures, chapel roof repairs, one county discussion about replacing the bell rope, and a complaint from 1979 about mail trucks overusing the Upper Ridge route. Vera took offense on behalf of the trucks. "Overusing," she muttered, as if delivering insulin was a hobby. Harriet marked the page with a blue pencil. "Useful." Dean noticed the color. "Blue means useful. Blue means possibly able to save us. Red means someone was an idiot." "You use a lot of red?" "I worked for the county for 31 years. Near dusk, when the windows had turned black and the library lights reflected tired faces back at them, Harriet went very still over a thin binder with a cracked spine. No one spoke. Even Kestrel lifted her head. Harriet adjusted her glasses and read silently for so long, Dean felt his patience begin to smoke. Finally, she said, "There you are, you little buried bone." Vera gripped the back of a chair. "What?" Harriet turned the binder toward them. At the top of the page was a county road committee memo dated more than 4 decades earlier. Dean leaned closer. The language was dry enough to kill weeds, But one line stood out. Upper Street Anselm Route to remain marked as County Winter Access Route for mail, medical, and supply passage during seasonal closures. Vera pressed one hand to her mouth. Maris leaned over the page, her face sharpening. "This isn't enough by itself." "No," Harriet said, "but it is not nothing." Dean looked down at the words. County Winter Access Route, not folklore, not sentiment, not an old woman's stubbornness wrapped in red wool. A route, a function, a duty once written plainly enough that even the future should have been ashamed to forget it. Under the table, Kestrel rested her muzzle on Dean's boot. He looked down. The small bell on her collar lay quiet against the worn leather, but Dean suddenly understood that quiet did not mean absence. Sometimes it meant waiting for the right hand to lift the rope. Vera's voice came softly. "Arthur said the road remembered." Dean looked at the memo again. "No," he said, surprising himself. "People forgot." "That's different." Harriet took the blue pencil and made a careful mark beside the line. Dean watched the bright blue circle close around the words. It looked nothing like a miracle. It looked like work. That made it harder to walk away from. By the next morning, Bell Road had become a table full of scraps. Not grand evidence. Not the sort of clean, shining proof that lawyers like to hold up in a meeting room with good lighting. Just fragments. A photocopy of the County Winter Access memo Harriet had found. 3 weather journals from Arthur's shelf. A packet of old maintenance invoices with rust stains along one edge. Vera's postal route maps, folded and refolded until the creases looked like riverbeds. A photograph of St. Anselm's from 1986, the bell tower dark against a wall of snow with a mail truck parked below it and one bundled figure standing beside the steps. Dean sat at the library table and stared at the mess. "It looks like a junk drawer had a nervous breakdown," he said. Harriet Sloane, who had arrived wearing a plum cardigan and an expression that suggested she had already defeated 3 lesser fools before breakfast, did not look up from her notes. "History often does," she said. "That is why people throw it away by mistake." Vera sat across from Dean with Arthur's bell book open before her. She had her old leather mailbag at her feet and a pencil tucked behind one ear. Kestrel lay beside the bag, chin on her paws, the little tarnished bell at her collar silent against the leather. Dean had told himself he was only helping organize the papers. Then Harriet gave him a legal pad. That was how traps began, not with chains, with office supplies. "We need statements," Harriet said. "Names, dates if possible, routes used, conditions, purpose of travel. Mail, medical, supply, livestock, emergency access, ordinary memories, written plainly." "Ordinary memories don't win hearings," Dean said. "They do when enough of them stand in the same direction." Vera's eyes flicked to him. "You know the first place we have to go." "No?" "I did not name it yet." "You were about to." Harriet finally looked up. "Mr. Holloway, if you intend to argue with old women, choose one at a time. We coordinate." Kestrel's tail moved once beneath the table. Dean gave the dog a look. "You too?" Kestrel did not dignify that with movement. The first stop was Rusk Hardware, a squat building on Main Street with a green metal roof and front windows crowded by snow shovels, lanterns, sacks of ice melt, and one hand-painted sign that said, "If you broke it after closing, it can stay broken until morning." A brass bell over the door rang when they entered. The man behind the counter did not look up right away. He was tightening a screw on a kerosene heater, his thick fingers moving with the patient irritation of someone who had never trusted factory assembly. He had a broad face reddened by cold, a short gray beard, and a brown canvas vest with so many pockets it seemed less like clothing than a small traveling shed. "Owen," Vera said. Owen Rusk looked up. His eyes went first to Vera, then Dean, then Kestrel. At the dog, something passed through his face and was gone before it could embarrass him. "Well," he said. Arthur's shadow finally dragged in a mechanic. Dean almost turned around. Owen set the screwdriver down. That was not an insult. It wore the right coat. Owen grunted. "If I insult you, you'll know. I use fewer syllables." Vera stepped between them before male pride could begin measuring antlers. "We need help with the bell tower." Owen's expression changed, not softened exactly, more like a door opening onto a room that had been kept warm. "Tower's been talking crooked for years." Dean frowned. "Talking crooked?" "A bell tower talks. Wood creaks one way when it's settling, another when it's warning you, and a third when it's just being dramatic, because old buildings enjoy attention." Against his will, Dean listened. Owen came around the counter, wiped his hands on a rag, and disappeared into the back room. He returned with a small cardboard box full of bolts, brackets, rusted washers, and one cracked pulley wheel. He put the box in front of Dean. "Want to save a bell," Owen said. "First you find where it's cracked." Dean looked down at the parts. "You kept these?" Arthur brought them in over the years. Said he meant to replace half the tower and ended up replacing half of himself instead. Owen tapped the cracked pulley with one blunt finger. "This one came out of St. Anselm's in '98. The rope was eating through it. Arthur kept saying the tower needed a proper inspection." "Why didn't he get one?" Dean asked. Owen looked at him. "Same reason you left your garage locked for 7 years. Men love pretending tomorrow is a plan." The words landed without shouting. That made them harder to dodge. Vera busied herself near a shelf of lantern wicks. Harriet, who had come along despite claiming she hated leaving the library because the public became disorganized without supervision, wrote Owen's name on a form. Kestrel moved toward the counter and sniffed the box of old hardware. Her nose touched the cracked pulley. Then she sat, straight-backed, as if Arthur himself had placed her there to make sure no one lied. Owen's mouth tightened. "Dog remembers that smell," he said. Dean looked at him. "Grease, pine dust, bell rope, Arthur's hands." Owen cleared his throat, annoyed by his own sentence. "She used to sleep under his workbench when he fixed chapel things." Dean reached into the box and lifted the pulley. It was heavier than it looked, worn deep in the groove where rope had passed over and over, year after year. Use had carved proof into it more honestly than any statement. For a moment, Dean imagined Arthur standing in this shop, turning the same pulley in his hands, saying he would get to it before the next storm. Then Dean imagined himself, years later, walking away from warning lights because anger felt cleaner than patience. He set the pulley down. Owen watched him. "You helping Vera?" "I'm looking at documents." "That's not what I asked." Dean did not answer. Owen nodded, as though silence had been a perfectly legible confession. "I'll look at the tower, but if it's bad, it's bad. I won't call rot historic just because Vera glares well." "I heard that," Vera said. "You were meant to." Their next visits took them across the Winter Valley, not in a heroic procession, but in Vera's old Subaru, which smelled faintly of peppermint, dog fur, and mailbag leather. Dean drove because Vera said she had delivered enough of Wyoming to deserve passenger privileges. Kestrel rode in the back seat, head between the front seats, her bell occasionally chiming when the vehicle hit ruts. They visited Maeve Larkin first, a retired mountain nurse who lived in a blue house near the frozen creek. She was in her late 60s, with white hair cut short, strong hands, and a voice that had probably told more stubborn men to sit down than church ever had. Maeve remembered Bell Road in pieces. Not poetry, not legend. She remembered slipping once near the North Ditch and cursing so loudly she claimed Arthur heard her over the wind. She remembered carrying heart medicine in her coat because the heater in her truck had failed. She remembered following the bell on a night when snow erased both fence and sky. "Was it official?" Harriet asked, pencil ready. Maeve frowned. Official enough that dispatch told me to use it when the lower road closed. Do you recall the year? No. Harriet's pencil paused. Maeve tapped her own temple. I remember the patient, though. Harold Baines, bad heart. Wife kept a yellow porch light. He lived 4 more years after that night and complained about soup every Tuesday. Harriet wrote that down. Dean watched Maeve sign her statement with a hand that did not tremble. Outside, as they returned to the Subaru, Vera was quiet. Dean said, "You all remember more than I expected." Vera looked at the snow gathered along the creek bank. "No, we remember less than we should. That is the trouble." After Maeve came Silas Grady, a retired delivery driver with a belly like a barrel and one glass eye that made it impossible to know whether he was being sincere or planning mischief. He lived behind the old feed store in a trailer surrounded by neatly stacked firewood. Silas invited them in, gave Kestrel a respectful nod, and produced from a drawer a faded route card sealed in a plastic sleeve. "Kept it because my first wife said I never kept anything useful," he said. "After the divorce, I became sentimental about proving her wrong." The card showed winter delivery alternatives, including Upper Street and Selm Route. Harriet looked at it like a hawk sighting field mice. Dean could almost hear her blue pencil humming. Silas gave his statement while eating crackers from a tin. He remembered waiting under the chapel tower during a whiteout because the bell told him he had reached the safe bend. He remembered Arthur bringing him coffee in a thermos. He remembered Vera delivering mail in weather that made sane people apologize to their own boots. "Bell wasn't decoration," Silas said. "Bell meant somebody had not forgotten you were out there." The sentence hung in the little trailer. Dean felt it more than he wanted to. Kestrel, lying by the heater, lifted her head and looked toward Vera. Vera did not look back. She had fixed her eyes on Silas's route card, but her mouth had pressed into a thin line. Dean understood then that this was not simply evidence for Vera. Each statement gave Arthur back to her for a minute, then took him away again. By late afternoon, they reached the ranch of Tom and Elise Brenner, a middle-aged couple whose land ran along the lower ridge. Tom had shoulders like a barn door and the slow speech of a man who refused to let weather hurry him. Elise was narrower, sharp-eyed, with gray threaded through her dark braid and a habit of correcting dates before anyone else finished getting them wrong. They remembered using Bell Road to move feed and livestock before a February storm 20 years earlier. Not because it was charming, because the lower route had iced over and the Chapel Pass, marked by sound, was safer if you knew how to read it. Elise brought out a photo album. "There," she said, pointing. The picture showed cattle moving through snow along a narrow ridge road. In the far distance, small but clear, rose the steeple of St. Anselm's. "And there," Elise said, tapping the edge of the photograph. Dean leaned closer. Near the line of cattle stood a younger Arthur Mallory in a heavy coat, one hand raised. Beside him, barely more than a black and gold streak, was a young German shepherd, Kestrel. Dean felt the dog press against his leg. He had not noticed her come to him. Elise smiled down at her. "I remember you. You chased one of our heifers back into line and then looked offended when nobody saluted." Kestrel gave one slow blink, as if accepting the apology 15 years late. Dean looked at the photograph again. The dog had been there. Arthur had been there. The road had been there. All of it had been working quietly, while people called it tradition and forgot that tradition sometimes was just survival with manners. On the drive back, nobody spoke for several miles. The sun had begun to drop behind the ridge, turning the snowfields pale gold. Vera held the photo album copy in her lap. Harriet sorted signed statements into folders with the focus of a surgeon. Kestrel slept with her head against the back of Dean's seat, her bell still. Dean kept both hands on the wheel. Finally, Vera said, "Arthur believed a person who had been led home owed the road something." Dean's jaw worked. I didn't ask him to save me. No, Vera said. Most saved people don't. That struck deeper than accusation would have. Dean wanted to be angry. Anger had handles. You could grip it. You could swing it like an axe. This was something worse, a clean statement set gently on the table. Harriet, perhaps sensing danger, opened Arthur's bell book on her lap. There is another entry here, she said. December 18th. Year is smudged. Dean knew before she read it. He knew, by the way, Kestrel woke. Harriet cleared her throat. Holloway found near North Ditch. Followed Bell. Too proud to thank anyone. Still alive. Good enough. The Subaru rolled on. No one laughed. Then Dean did. Once, a short, rough sound with no place to go. Sounds like him, he said. Arthur? Vera asked. No. Dean looked at the road. Me? In his mind, the old chapel returned, snow melting from his sleeves, his fingers wrapped around a tin cup of coffee so hot it hurt. Arthur standing near the stove, not asking questions. Young Kestrel at the door, ears too large for her head, watching Dean as if she had already decided he was trouble that might improve with supervision. Arthur had not lectured him. That had been the mercy. A lecture Dean could have hated. Silence had required him to live with himself. They returned to the library after dark. Maris Kent was waiting in the local history room, coat open, field book on the table, a paper cup of coffee cooling beside her. She looked at the growing stack of signed statements and photographs. That's more than I expected, she said. Try to sound less shocked, Harriet replied. Maris picked up the route card from Silas and read it carefully. This helps, but Wynn's people will argue these are old, sporadic, not enough to prove current public necessity. Vera sat down heavily. For the first time that day, her age showed in the way she removed her gloves one finger at a time. Dean looked at the statements, at the maps, at the photocopy of the county memo. Then we get current proof. Maris looked at him. That means survey work, field verification, road condition assessment, marker locations, sight and sound range if you're claiming the bell had an operational purpose. Who does that? A voice from the doorway answered. Unfortunately, I do. A man stood just inside the room, holding a rolled survey map and a black tube under one arm. He was younger than Dean expected, maybe late 30s, tall but narrow, wearing a mustard-orange reflective jacket over a navy vest. Snow had melted in his dark blonde hair, leaving it damp across his forehead. His face had the strained alertness of someone who trusted measurements because people were harder. Maris nodded. Nolan Price, County Survey Office. Nolan gave the room a polite look that managed to apologize for his presence without offering to leave. I was asked to review the upper route, he said. Preliminary opinion is that closure may be recommended. Vera's chin lifted. Harriet reached for the red pencil. Nolan saw it and wisely continued. Because of liability, not preference. The road lacks modern markers. Maintenance history is inconsistent. Slope exposure near Miller Draw is significant. If the county keeps it open, they need to justify why. Dean stood. You read what we found? I skimmed the memo. Skimmed? Nolan's cheeks colored slightly. Mr. Holloway, I am not the enemy. No, Dean said. You're the man holding the ruler while someone else cuts the road in half. Silence tightened. Kestrel rose from under the table and stepped between them. She did not growl. She did not bark. She simply stood there, black and gold, bell silent, amber eyes moving from Dean to Nolan as if both men had failed a simple lesson in staying useful. Dean looked down at her. Then he stepped back. Nolan noticed. So did everyone else. Maris folded her arms. Nolan, look at the full packet, then walk the route before you write anything final. Nolan hesitated. Wynn's attorney is pressing for timeline. Attorneys press, Harriet said. That is how they reproduce. Vera made a sound that might have been a cough. Nolan looked at the table, at the photographs, at Arthur's bell book, at Kestrel, who had not moved. Finally, he set his black map tube on the table. I will conduct a field assessment, he said. No promise beyond that. Dean nodded once. It was not gratitude, not yet, but it was not refusal either. Kestrel turned and settled beside Vera's chair. Her bell gave the smallest sound as she lay down. Ling. In that small room full of paper, old names, wet coats, and tired people, Dean heard something begin to assemble. Not victory, not even hope. Something more difficult. A road being remembered one witness at a time. The town hall looked too bright for winter. That was Dean's first thought when he stepped inside. Outside, Pine Hollow had gone soft under evening snow. Storefronts glowed amber. Tires whispered through slush. The mountains stood dark beyond town, as if they had turned their backs on human arguments. But inside the hall, the fluorescent lights shone hard and white over folding chairs, polished floorboards, coffee urns, poster boards, and the careful faces of people trying to decide whether hope had a price. Kestrel walked beside Dean's left leg, her small bell quiet beneath the murmur of voices. Don't look at me like this was my idea, Dean muttered. The shepherd did not look at him. That was answer enough. Vera Mallory sat near the front, straight-backed in her faded cranberry coat, Arthur's old leather mailbag resting by her boots. Harriet Sloane had taken a seat beside her with 3 folders in her lap and a red pencil tucked behind one ear, like a warning flag. Owen Rusk stood at the back near the wall, arms folded over his brown canvas vest, looking as though he had come mainly to inspect the structural weakness of public optimism. Maris Kent leaned against the side wall in uniform, not participating, not hiding. Her black field book was in one hand. Dean had begun to understand that when Maris held that book, she was listening with ink. At the front of the room stood Coulter Wynn. Dean recognized him immediately, though they had never met. Some men entered a room the way a well-made knife entered a drawer, quietly, cleanly, certain of its own edge. Wynn wore a charcoal wool coat over a navy suit, a pale gray scarf folded with expensive care, and black leather gloves he had not yet removed. He was 40-something, fit, dark-haired with silver at the temples, clean-shaven, and handsome in the polished way that made people forgive a sentence before they understood what it meant. Beside him stood 2 easels with renderings of glass-front chalets, warm fires, restaurant windows, ski lights, and families smiling in a version of winter that had clearly never had to dig a plow out before dawn. On a long table, glossy brochures lay arranged like prayer cards. Juniper Ridge. Winter Haven. Dean nearly laughed. Winter never had havens, only temporary agreements. A county commissioner introduced Wynn with the cautious cheer of a man grateful someone else had brought colored charts. Wynn stepped forward, removed his gloves, and smiled. Not wide, not false. That was the trouble. Thank you for coming out on a cold night, Wynn began. I know weather like this makes staying home tempting. A few people chuckled. He spoke well. Dean gave him that. The man did not sell like a carnival barker. He offered jobs, tax revenue, better road maintenance, a restaurant that would buy from local ranchers, seasonal work for young adults, a partnership with the county, a memorial plaque honoring St. Anselm's Chapel and the families who had kept Juniper Ridge alive through hard winters. He said all the words a room wanted to hear. Then he chose the knife. We all respect history, Wynn said, his voice softening, especially the history preserved by people like Mrs. Vera Mallory. A woman of great dignity, still trying to protect a time that meant something to her generation. Several heads turned toward Vera. Dean felt the shift before he understood it, Nothing Wynne said was openly cruel. That was why it worked. He had not called Vera foolish. He had placed her gently behind glass. He had turned her from a witness into a relic and asked the town to admire her while moving on. Vera's face did not change. Her hand, however, closed on the handle of Arthur's mailbag. Wynne clicked to the next rendering. A lodge appeared on the screen, all golden windows and civilized snow. "The chapel can be remembered," he said. "The bell can be honored. We can preserve the spirit of the old passage while acknowledging that the physical route no longer meets the safety expectations of a modern county." A man in the second row nodded slowly. A woman near the aisle looked down at her hands. Dean saw what Wynne was doing to them. Not bullying, not bribing, not exactly. He was offering them permission to be tired. Tired of bad roads, tired of scraping by, tired of watching young people leave, tired of choosing between memory and money. Small towns did not always sell their souls because they were greedy. Sometimes they sold pieces of them because nobody had asked what survival cost. Wynne continued. A tasteful marker near the resort entrance would tell the story of St. Anselm's. We are not erasing anything. We are making sure the past is honored safely. Safely. The word moved around the room with clean shoes. Kestrel rose. Dean looked down. No. She walked forward anyway, not fast. Not dramatic. Her black and gold body moved down the center aisle with calm purpose, the little bell on her collar making one faint sound. Ling. People turned. Kestrel stopped beside Vera's chair and pressed her shoulder against the old woman's knee. Only then did Vera stand. For a moment, the room seemed embarrassed by its own brightness. Vera was small under those white lights, smaller than the glossy posters, smaller than the projection screen, smaller than all the numbers Wynne had brought. Then she opened Arthur's bell book. "I am not going to tell you a story," she said. Her voice was thin at first. Kestrel leaned against her. Vera drew a breath. "I am going to read names." Wynne's smile stayed in place, but something behind it tightened. Vera looked down. Maeve Larkin. January 14th, 1993. Medical delivery over Bell Road during Lower Road closure. Harold Baines received heart medication. The room became quieter. Silas Grady. February 2nd, 1988. Supply truck held at St. Anselm's until whiteout passed. Bell rung from 4:10 to 7:25. Dean saw Silas in the middle row, his glass eye catching the light. The old driver stopped chewing the mint in his mouth. Tom and Elise Brenner, February 17th, 2001. Livestock moved through Upper Passage ahead of Stormline. Arthur Mallory assisted at Ridge Marker. Elise sat straighter. Vera turned a page. Vera Mallory. Too many winters to count. Mail, pension checks, prescriptions, grief notices, wedding invitations, court summons, apologies, and once a birthday card carried 12 miles because a woman named Ruth said her brother would think she forgot him if it came late. A few people looked up at that. Dean had not expected it to hurt. It did. Vera continued, name by name. Not all were dramatic. Some sounded almost plain. A tractor part, a doctor visit, a package of insulin, a chimney repair, a widow brought down before an ice storm, a county snow crew using the chapel as a holding point. Each name put a nail through Wynne's polished air. Then Vera paused. Dean knew before she spoke. His body knew. Holloway, Vera said softly. Dean, found near North Ditch after following Bell through whiteout. No injury requiring transport. Severe cold exposure. Coffee administered by Arthur Mallory, who wrote, "Too proud to thank anyone. Still alive. Good enough." A ripple moved through the hall. Not laughter. Recognition. Dean felt every head turn. His first instinct was old and sharp. Leave. Walk out, slam the door, Let them keep their bell and their road and their bright room full of judging faces. He had spent years building a life where nobody could look at him in public and remember anything important. Kestrel looked back over her shoulder. Her eyes were amber and steady, and for once Dean did not see Arthur's dog. He saw the young shepherd by the chapel door from years ago, watching him lie to himself about not being scared. Dean stood. The chair legs scraped too loudly against the floor. He did not go to the front. He did not need a stage. He stood in the back of the room, next to Owen Rusk and the wall of notices about bake sales, road closures, and flu shots. "I did follow that bell," Dean said. His voice sounded rougher than he intended. The room waited. He looked at Wynne, then at the people who had looked down at their hands. "I didn't thank Arthur. I should have. I didn't thank Vera. I should have done that too." He swallowed. "I don't know what language the county wants for it. Route, passage, access, hazard, liability. I only know that one night, when snow took the road away, that bell gave it back." No one moved. Dean looked toward the renderings of warm chalets. They were beautiful, he supposed, in the way a locked gate could be beautiful. "It wasn't folklore," he said. "I'm standing here because it worked." Then he sat down. His heart was pounding. Owen leaned slightly toward him. "That's the most words I've heard out of you since the Reagan administration." Dean stared forward. "I was not alive enough for most of the Reagan administration to matter." Still excessive. At the front, Wynne inclined his head, gracious as a prince, accepting rain. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "I appreciate your candor, truly. But no one here doubts that the bell served a purpose once. The question is whether an aging structure and an unmodernized winter path should continue to dictate the future of this ridge." There it was. The pivot. Not denial. Not insult. Wynne took their truth, bowed to it, and tried to bury it under tomorrow. After the meeting, people gathered in low clusters. Some came to Vera, touched her arm, said they remembered this or that, promised to look in old drawers. Others drifted toward Wynne's brochures with the guilty fascination of people studying weather they hoped would miss their roof. Dean stepped outside for air. Snow fell gently now, each flake bright in the parking lot lights. Kestrel came with him and shook herself once, bell chiming faintly. Across the lot, Dean saw Wynne speaking with Nolan Price near a dark SUV. Nolan held his survey tube under one arm. His posture was stiff. Wynne stood relaxed, one gloved hand resting on the open driver's door. Dean could not hear every word. He did not need to. Exposure to liability. Professional recommendation. Court scrutiny. Career. Nolan's face tightened in the way a man's face did when someone spoke to his fear with perfect grammar. Maris appeared beside Dean. "He's not threatening him directly," Dean said. "No?" Maris replied. "That would be less efficient. You going to stop it?" From a man discussing legal consequences in a parking lot? She gave him a side look. "You want me to arrest Tone?" Dean said nothing. Maris tucked her field book into her coat pocket. "Wynne is not wrong about risk. That's what makes him dangerous. If the records stay thin, the board may choose the safest legal option. Close the road. Preserve the chapel as a landmark, maybe. Remove the function. Keep the shell. Silence the bell." Dean watched Wynne's SUV lights flare as the engine started. "A symbol with no job," he said. Maris nodded. "A polite grave." That night, Dean went to St. Anselm's with Owen and Vera. The meeting had left something sour in him, and he had learned long ago that sourness turned less poisonous when applied to work. Owen brought tool bags, a ladder, a portable light, and the expression of a man who distrusted both ladders and gravity, but had made peace with needing them. The chapel was colder at night. Their breath clouded in the beam of Owen's work light. Vera lit the small stove, though it did more for morale than temperature. Kestrel stayed near the bell rope, ears lifted toward the tower. Owen climbed first, muttering under his breath about architects, saints, and people who built steeples without considering future access by irritated hardware store owners. Dean followed part way, bracing the ladder. The tower smelled of old wood, dust, iron, and weather. The great bell hung above them, dark and patient, its rim dulled by age. Dean ran his gloved fingers along a support beam. Dry checking. Some rot near the joint. Not good. Not fatal either. Owen examined the yoke, the rope channel, the side braces. "Needs work," he said. "That your official diagnosis?" "If I made it official, I'd charge." Then his light stopped on a metal tag wired around the bell's support frame. Owen grew still. "What?" Dean asked. Owen reached up, pulled the tag closer, and read. His mouth hardened. Vera called from below. "Owen?" He climbed down slower than he had climbed up. Dean followed. Owen held out a folded paper that had been tucked into a plastic sleeve and fixed to the tower frame. Vera took it. Dean saw her face lose color as she read. "What is it?" he asked. Owen answered for her. "Temporary safety removal order. Private engineer's recommendation, effective immediately." Dean felt his stomach drop. Vera's voice came thin. "Removal?" "Bell gets taken down for inspection," Owen said. "Stored at Hasker Contracting until the structure is evaluated." "They can't just take it," Vera said. Maris had not been called, but Dean suddenly wished she were there. Owen tapped the paper. "Looks like they can if the county accepted a safety filing and nobody challenged it fast enough." Dean took the page. The language was clean, professional, responsible. It mentioned public safety, falling hazards, preservation of historic material, temporary relocation, structural assessment. Wynn's name was not on the signature line, the engineer's was. But Wynn's shadow sat on every sentence. "When?" Dean asked. Owen pointed to the date. "That morning?" Dean looked up toward the tower. For the first time since he had arrived, the great bell seemed less like an old guardian and more like a prisoner who had just been handed a polite sentence. Vera walked to the bell rope and placed one hand on it. Kestrel came beside her, sat, and lifted her face toward the dark hole of the steeple. No one spoke. The chapel held them in a cold circle of lamplight and wood. Dean understood then that Wynn had not stolen the bell in the crude way of a thief. He had done something worse. He had wrapped silence in procedure. He had put gloves on erasure and called it care. Vera's fingers tightened around the rope. "If they take it," she said, "Bell Road has no voice." Owen removed his cap and looked at the floor. Dean folded the order carefully. Too carefully. If he did not keep his hands busy, he was not sure what they would do. Outside, the wind moved over the pass. Kestrel's little collar bell stirred once. Ling, small, defiant. Dean looked at the dog, then at the tower, then at Vera standing beneath a bell that had just been scheduled for disappearance. "No," he said. Vera turned. Dean slid the folded order into his coat pocket. "If they want to fight over whether this bell ever had a job," he said, "then they can hear what it sounds like before they take it down." Owen looked at him. "That is not a plan." Dean's eyes stayed on the bell rope. "No," he said, "but it's the beginning of one." Above them, the great bell hung silent in the dark, waiting for hands that had not yet decided how much they were willing to lose. By noon the next day, the great bell was gone. No crowd gathered to watch it leave. No villain stood in the snow laughing. No chains rattled under moonlight. It happened in daylight, with paperwork taped to a clipboard and two men from Hasker Contracting wearing hard hats and apologetic faces. That made it worse. Dean stood in the chapel yard with Vera, Owen, and Kestrel while the contractors lowered the bell from St. Anselm's tower. The old iron body swung once in the cold air, slow and heavy, catching a strip of winter sun along its rim. For one breath, it looked less like an object and more like a heart being removed from a chest. Vera said nothing. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of her cranberry coat, but Dean could see the knuckles pressing hard against the fabric. Kestrel sat at her side, rigid, her amber eyes fixed on the bell as if she had been ordered to guard something no living creature could guard. The contractor in charge, a broad man with wind-burned cheeks, stepped toward Vera. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we'll keep it safe at the yard until inspection clears." Vera looked at him. Safe is a busy word these days. The man lowered his eyes. Dean did not blame him. Men with work gloves often carried out decisions made by men with cleaner hands. When the truck finally rolled away, the chapel seemed to shrink. The tower still stood, but the space where the bell had hung made the whole building feel toothless. Owen removed his cap, scratched his head, and put it back on. "Well," he said, "now it's quiet." Dean kept looking at the empty tower. Most people, he suspected, saw loss. He saw a missing part. That was not the same thing. "Sound doesn't have to come from one bell," Dean said. Vera turned slowly. Owen squinted at him. "That sentence is either useful or stupid. I need more of it." Dean looked down the old line of Bell Road, where snow lifted in thin veils over the surface. The road bends through the pass. Wind usually comes west or northwest. If one bell is gone, you don't replace it with another big one overnight. You mark the route with smaller sound points, different tones, different distances. Owen's expression changed, not excitement. Owen did not waste face on excitement, but something in his eyes clicked into gear. "A bell line," he said. "A rough one." Rough beats silent. Vera looked from one man to the other. "You can do that?" Dean almost said no. That had become his most practiced word. Instead, he heard Arthur's old note in Harriet's voice. Too proud to thank anyone. Still alive. Good enough. He glanced at Kestrel. The shepherd had stopped looking at the empty tower and was watching him now. Dean sighed. "I can try." Owen grunted. That's the ugliest version of yes. 2 hours later, Dean unlocked his old garage for the first time in years. The building stood on the edge of Pine Hollow, half hidden behind a drifted chain-link fence, and a sign so faded that Holloway Mountain Repair looked like it belonged to someone already dead. Snow had piled against the bay doors. Dean shoveled enough to force one side open. The door shrieked upward on its track, and the sound went through him like a complaint from the past. Inside, the garage smelled of cold oil, dust, old rubber, dry wood, and disuse. Light slipped through grimy windows in pale bars. A workbench ran along the far wall. Pegboards still held wrenches, pliers, old belts, wire, clamps, and tools Dean had once known by reach alone. In the corner sat the black shape of a wood stove, unlit for years. The floor held ghost marks where engines had leaked, tires had turned, men had stood with coffee, and bad news. Dean did not move for a moment. He had thought the place would accuse him. It did something worse. It waited. Kestrel walked in ahead of everyone, nose low, paws silent on the concrete. She sniffed near the stove, then the workbench, then stopped beside an old generator under a canvas tarp. She circled once and lowered herself beneath the table. Dean remembered that exact spot. Arthur had stood there once, one elbow on the bench, arguing gently that the chapel's backup generator needed more than one more season. Kestrel, younger then, had slept under the table with paws too large for her body. Dean had promised he would get to it. The memory did not strike like lightning. It settled like a hand on the shoulder. Owen came in carrying a crate. "You going to stare the shop back to life, or should I start charging rent?" Dean crossed to the stove. "Wood bin's empty." "I brought kindling." "Of course you did." "I assumed your planning skills remained decorative." Soon the stove began to catch, giving off the dusty heat of a room, remembering its purpose. Owen set his crate on the workbench. Inside were bells of every kind: brass sleigh bells, a chipped handbell from the hardware counter, 2 goat bells with leather straps, a triangle-shaped ranch dinner bell, several old shop bells, and 1 cowbell so dented it looked as if it had survived a theological disagreement. Dean lifted it. "This one sounds terrible." Owen nodded. "Good, you'll hear it in weather." Harriet arrived next in a wool coat the color of storm plums, carrying rolled maps under one arm and a cardboard file box under the other. Her boots left neat wet marks on the concrete. "I dislike workshops," she said. "Too many tools with unclear filing systems." Dean took the map rolls. "Good to see you, too." Maris came with printed weather reports, incident summaries, and a thermos of coffee nobody trusted until Owen tried it and survived. Nolan Price arrived last, wearing his reflective jacket and the expression of a man who feared he had been invited to a folk ritual that would later appear in court transcripts. "I want it understood," Nolan said, setting down his GPS unit and survey flags, "that a temporary acoustic marking system does not establish legal access by itself." Harriet removed a blue pencil from her pocket. "Wonderful. We will not put that on a cake." Nolan blinked. Dean almost smiled. They spread the maps across the workbench. Vera stood beside them with Arthur's bell book open, writing names in a fresh ledger as people began arriving with bells. It started slowly. A ranch hand brought 2 rusted sleigh bells from a barn door. Maeve Larkin sent a brass handbell she had once used at the clinic desk. Silas Grady brought a trucker's warning bell and claimed it had saved 3 marriages by announcing his return before his first wife could hide the pie. Elise Brenner delivered a string of old harness bells, polished before she handed them over. "My mother kept these," she said. "Said they sounded better than men explaining themselves." Tom Brenner said nothing, but he carried in 2 cedar posts and leaned them against the wall. Vera wrote every name, not because the law required it, because names were how a town proved it had not been built by fog. Dean watched her write. Something about it bothered him in the right way. He went to the pegboard and lifted the small wooden-handled wrench Arthur had once given him. He had taken it from the cabin that morning without admitting why. Its handle was dark from age and use. A faint crack ran down one side, smooth under his thumb. He placed it on the bench beside the maps. Vera noticed. So did Kestrel. The shepherd rose from under the table, walked over, and touched the wrench once with her nose. No bell rang. No one spoke. For Dean, the whole shop shifted half an inch closer to mercy. Then Owen ruined it, mercifully. "If the dog blesses every tool, we'll be here until Easter." Work began. Dean explained the bell line in practical terms because practical things were safer than feelings. Each bell point would sit close enough to the road to be heard by someone already near the route, not someone wandering a mile out into open country. The tones needed to differ: higher bells near sharp turns, deeper bells near exposed sections, clusters near the chapel approach. Owen would build curved wooden brackets to face the prevailing wind and push sound down the corridor of the road. Nolan would mark coordinates. Harriet would compare each point to old maps and known use markers. Maris would document the installation as a temporary safety measure pending review, Vera wrote. Kestrel watched. By afternoon, the first posts went up along Bell Road. The sky was bright but restless. Sunlight flashed across the snow, and wind moved over the pass in long, invisible hands. Dean drove the utility truck slowly, with Owen in the passenger seat complaining about suspension, morality, and the decline of American bolts. Nolan followed in a county vehicle, stopping every 100 yards to take readings and plant flags. Harriet stayed mostly in the truck, rolling down the window only to correct names and insult map legends. Maris moved between points, photographing each installation. Vera insisted on coming for the first stretch. She sat wrapped in her red coat, Arthur's ledger in her lap, watching each bell go up as if witnessing small lanterns being lit. Kestrel rode in the bed of Dean's truck beside a bundle of posts, steady as a statue, her nose lifted to the wind. At the first bend, they hung 3 sleigh bells on a cedar arm. Owen shook the bracket. The bells chimed bright and thin. "Too pretty," Dean said. Owen added the dented cowbell below them. The next shake produced a sound like a goat falling into a pantry. Dean nodded. "Better?" Nolan, despite himself, wrote it down. They worked through the afternoon. Bells at the stone culvert, bells near the north ditch, bells at the mail turn. Bells where wind would cut across from the high meadow. Each point became part of a language made of metal, wood, weather, and stubbornness. Once, Dean took a shortcut across what looked like firm snow. Kestrel moved in front of him immediately. He stopped. "Move." She did not. Owen looked over. "Dog says no." "Dog doesn't hold a survey license." Nolan looked at the snow, then pushed his pole into it. The crust broke through into a soft drift, nearly 3 feet deep. Dean looked at Kestrel. Kestrel looked back. Harriet, from the truck window, called, "Please enter into the record that the dog has better field judgment than the mechanic." Dean pointed at her. "You're enjoying this too much." "I enjoy accuracy." They found the old sign near the northern pines just as the sun began leaning low. Kestrel discovered it first, though not with any dramatic barking. She simply stopped at the edge of a shallow drift, lowered her head, and began scraping with one paw. Slow, deliberate, not digging for treasure. Clearing a thing she seemed to think humans had no excuse for burying. Dean crouched beside her and brushed snow away with his glove. Wood appeared, gray, split, half-rotted. Nolan came over with his camera. Owen knelt on one knee and helped lift the edge free. The sign was small, no wider than a man's chest. Its painted letters had faded, but enough remained under the weathered grain to read. Bell Road. Public Winter Passage. No one cheered. That would have been too cheap for the moment. Vera touched the top edge with 2 fingers. Arthur said there used to be more signs. Nolan photographed it from 3 angles. Then he took out his notebook and wrote carefully, lips pressed together. Dean watched him. "Still an alleged access route?" Dean asked. Nolan did not look up. "No," he said. The wind moved through the pines. Kestrel's collar bell answered softly. Ling. Nolan finished writing and closed his notebook. Bell Road. It was only a name, but names were how things climbed out of graves. They returned to the garage after dark, tired, cold, and carrying snow in every seam of their clothing. The bell line was incomplete, but a rough first stretch now stood along the route. Vera's ledger held a list of contributors. Nolan had coordinates. Maris had photographs. Harriet had already begun labeling folders as if she could force the future into order by alphabetizing it. Then Maris's radio crackled. She stepped outside to listen, came back with her expression changed. "Storm warning updated," she said. "Whiteout conditions expected tomorrow evening, 2 days earlier than forecast." Silence took the shop. Owen set down a bracket. "How bad?" "Bad enough that county is preparing lower road closures." Nolan looked toward the maps. "I still have not completed the Miller Draw assessment." Harriet removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Vera looked at the bells laid across the bench, all those small donated voices waiting for posts. Dean turned toward the open garage bay. Beyond it, the night over Pine Hollow was clear for now, stars burning cold above the town. The ridge stood white and quiet in the distance. Too quiet. Owen came to stand beside him. "Well," he said, "when we'll enjoy that?" "He'll say the storm proves the road is dangerous." "It is dangerous," Dean nodded. "So is pretending people won't use it." Kestrel came to his side. Her shoulder brushed his leg, not leaning much, just enough. Dean listened. From the completed stretch up the hill, carried faintly by the wind, came a scattered sound. Not the great voice of St. Anselm's, not yet. Small bells, different tones, uneven, imperfect, a patchwork sound stitched across the dark. Dean looked toward the ridge. "If the road still wants to speak," he said, "tomorrow night it may have to do it in the voice of the whole town." Owen was quiet for once. Then he said, "That sounded almost poetic. You feverish?" Dean pulled his gloves tighter. "No," he said, "just busy." Behind them, Kestrel's little bell gave one soft, stubborn answer. The storm arrived white, not gray, not black, not the bruised blue of a mountain evening turning mean. It came bright as a sheet held against the sun, a blinding whiteness that erased distance first, then edges, then judgment. By 3 in the afternoon, Juniper Ridge had lost its shape. The sky lowered until it seemed to rest on the pines. Snow moved sideways across Bell Road in hard, shining veils. Fences disappeared. Ditches became smooth traps. The chapel roof, the ridge, the road, the frozen meadows, all of it blurred together until the world looked unfinished, as if God had sketched Wyoming in charcoal and then wiped his hand across the page. At the Pine Hollow Sheriff's substation, Maris Kent stood over a radio console with her coat still on and her field book open beside her. "Say your location again," she said. Static answered first. Then a woman's voice broke through. "Kent, this is Maeve Larkin. I'm south of the upper mail turn, I think. Visibility maybe 20 feet. I delivered the prescription to Mrs. Halloran, but the lower road's gone white." "Stay in your vehicle unless you have a fixed marker in sight," Maris said. "Engine on 10 minutes, off 10. Keep your exhaust clear." Another channel crackled before Maeve could answer. "This is Rusk Delivery," a man said, strained but trying to sound annoyed rather than frightened. "Generator drop for Owen's store is stuck near the chapel spur. I can't tell if I'm on the road or parked in a cloud." Maris wrote fast. A third call came from the Brenner Ranch truck. Tom and Elise had moved feed before the worst of the weather and now sat somewhere below Miller Draw, unable to see the next fence post. Then Nolan Price called in. His voice was clipped at first, professional, controlled. "Deputy Kent, this is Nolan Price, County Survey Unit. I'm near marker point 7, approaching Miller Draw. I still have visual on the reflective flag." Maris looked toward the window. Snow struck the glass in bright bursts. "Price, abandon the assessment and return to a safe point." There was a pause. "I can finish the draw reading in 10 minutes. "Nolan, I have gear. You have ambition and a weather report that just got worse. Turn back." Static swallowed his reply. Maris muttered something uncharitable about men, maps, and selective hearing. At street. Anselm's Vera Mallory sat inside the cold chapel with both hands wrapped around the low pull rope Dean had rigged the night before. Owen had installed a simple pulley system, not elegant, not historic, but practical. The main bell was gone, but the temporary line connected to a cluster of smaller bells mounted beneath the tower frame, enough to carry sound down the first throat of the pass. Vera wore wool gloves under leather ones. Her cranberry coat was buttoned to the chin. Her white hair had escaped its pins around her temples. She looked small on the old chair beneath the empty tower. She did not look weak. Owen stood near the stove, feeding it thin splits of wood. He had hung 2 lanterns from nails in the wall and placed a thermos beside Vera's chair. "You don't have to pull like you're trying to wake the dead," he said. Vera glanced at him. "You were friends with Arthur. You know the dead sleep lightly around this place?" Owen grunted. "Then tap politely." Outside, Dean Holloway stood beside his truck, with Kestrel at his knee, and watched the bell line vanish into the white. He wore his olive-drab combat shirt beneath the waxed canvas coat, scarf pulled high, gloves cinched tight. A tool bag hung across one shoulder. A radio was clipped to his chest. Flares, rope, spare brackets, and a flashlight rode in his pack. Kestrel's black and gold coat was already powdered white along the spine. Her amber eyes narrowed against the wind. She lifted her muzzle, reading weather with a seriousness no instrument could imitate. Dean crouched in front of her. "You get tired, we turn back." Kestrel stared at him. "I know you heard me." Her small collar bell trembled under the gust. Ling. Dean sighed. That was not an argument. The first bells began behind him. Vera pulled from inside the chapel. The sound went out small and layered, not the deep old voice that had once lived in the tower, but a cluster of bright notes that darted through the wind like metal birds. Farther down the line, the wind caught the sleigh bells at the first bend. Then the dented cowbell answered lower. Then another cluster, higher and sharper, from the cedar bracket near the stone culvert. The road did not roar back into existence. It whispered. But it whispered in more than one place. Dean started along the line, Kestrel moving ahead by 10 feet, stopping, looking back, waiting. Snow struck his goggles. His boots sank through fresh powder into hidden crust. Every few yards, the world disappeared and returned in fragments. A cedar post, a silver bell, a strip of red survey tape thrashing like a wounded flag. "Bell point 1 secure," Dean said into the radio. Maris's voice came back thin. "Copy. Maeve reports she hears high bells east of her position." Dean reached the second post. Owen's ugly cowbell swung in the gust, producing a sound like an irritated bull trapped in a pantry. Dean almost laughed despite the cold. "Point 2 secure." "Rusk delivery reports hearing a lower tone," Maris said. "He thinks he's near the chapel spur." "He is. Tell him not to move unless he sees the reflector." Kestrel stopped suddenly. Dean nearly walked into her. Ahead, the snow surface looked smooth. Too smooth. Dean planted his stick. The crust broke into a hidden ditch where wind had filled the hollow clean to the top. "Good catch," he told her. Kestrel did not wag. Praise, to her, seemed to be a thing humans needed more than dogs. They pressed on. At the chapel, Vera pulled in steady intervals. Not hard, not frantic. 3 breaths. Pull. 3 breaths. Pull. The rope moved through the pulley with a dry whisper. Owen stood close enough to take over if her hands failed, but not so close that he stole the work from her. After several minutes, Vera's shoulders began to tremble. Owen noticed. "Break." "No." "Vera." She kept her eyes on the frosted window. "When I carried mail, Arthur used to ring until I was past Miller Draw. I told him once he could stop sooner. He said a road should never quit talking while someone was still listening." Owen looked away first. Then he took the second rope Dean had rigged beside hers. "Fine," he said. "But if we wake the dead, you explain why I'm underdressed." Together they pulled. The little tower bells rang out again. On the ridge, the sound reached Nolan Price as his GPS failed. At first, it was just a blinking screen, then the coordinates jumped, then the whiteout folded over him so completely that the reflective flag he had marked 30 feet away vanished like a thought he had not written down quickly enough. Nolan stood beside his county vehicle near Miller Draw and felt the professional part of his mind begin listing errors. Stayed too long. Underestimated wind speed. Moved beyond last confirmed safe marker. Assumed equipment would hold. He opened the driver's door, intending to get inside and wait, but a gust slammed it partly shut against his hip. His survey tube rolled from the passenger seat and disappeared under the vehicle. He cursed, bent to grab it, and when he straightened, the truck seemed to have turned. That was impossible. The truck had not moved. The world had. He took 3 steps toward what he thought was the road shoulder and found nothing but white. No marker, no vehicle shape, no ridgeline. His breath quickened. He knew the science of whiteout conditions. He knew how depth perception failed, how the brain lost horizon and invented slopes where none existed. He knew all of that in the clean way a person knows fire is hot before touching the stove. Knowing did not help the animal part of him. He pressed the radio button. "Kent, this is Price. I've lost visual reference near Miller Draw." Static. He tried again. "Maris, do you copy?" The wind answered. Nolan turned slowly, fighting the urge to hurry. Hurrying was how people walked off roads, into ditches, over edges. His boots crunched. Snow hit his face. The reflective tape on his sleeve flashed back at him, meaningless. Then he heard it. 3 thin notes, high, high, high. A pause, a deeper bell. Then the 3 thin notes again. Nolan froze. Not because the sound was beautiful. It was not. It was uneven, wind-bent, faint enough to doubt. But he had plotted that sequence on Dean's map. Northern turn before Miller Draw, 3 high bells over 1 low. He turned toward the sound. Step by step he followed it. Once the wind stole it completely, and panic rose in him so fast he nearly ran. Then the notes returned, thinner now, but real. 3 high, 1 low. He moved toward them until a dark shape appeared in the white. For 1 wild second he thought it was a person. Then Kestrel stepped out of the snow, black and gold under a coat of white, eyes steady as lamps. Nolan laughed once. It came out broken. "You?" he said. Kestrel turned and walked away. Nolan followed. Dean appeared behind her, scarf crusted with ice, one hand holding the rope line he had strung between 2 posts. "You hurt?" Dean asked. Nolan shook his head. "No." "You sure?" "No." "That's more honest." Nolan bent forward, hands on knees, breathing hard. His face had gone pale beneath windburn. Snow clung to his eyebrows. "My GPS jumped," he said. "I lost the truck." Dean pointed with his flashlight. The beam caught a faint red reflector 20 yards away. "Truck's there. You walk downslope." Nolan looked at the shallow drop beyond him. In clearer weather, it would have seemed harmless. In whiteout, it looked like a mouth. He swallowed. Dean handed him the radio. "Say it." Nolan looked at him. "Say what you know." For a moment, pride, fear, training, and truth fought behind Nolan's eyes. Then he pressed the button. "Kent, this is Price." His voice shook, but he did not hide it. "Record this. Bell line has operational value for orientation under whiteout conditions near Miller Draw. Audible sequence confirmed. Reflective markers alone insufficient in current visibility." Static crackled. Then Maris replied, "Copied, Price." A pause. Her voice softened by half a degree. "Glad you're still with us." Nolan closed his eyes. Dean pretended not to see. Other reports came in one by one. Maeve followed the high eastern bells to the old mail turn and parked safely behind a windbreak. Rusk Delivery located the chapel spur and stayed put until Owen could guide him by radio. Tom and Elise Brenner found the reflector near the lower cedar post after hearing the cowbell cluster and waited in their truck, irritated but alive. The bell line did not rescue them like a miracle. It did something humbler. It gave each person one more true thing in a world of white lies. Then came the call nobody wanted. "Deputy Kent," a clipped male voice said over the channel, barely audible. "This is Coulter Wynn." Dean, Nolan, and Kestrel were back near the chapel spur when Maris repeated the name over radio. Dean looked toward the new development road east of the ridge. Of course. Wynne had been inspecting the lower access to his project before the storm sealed it. His SUV sat somewhere off the unfinished spur, where the grading had cut through open ground without trees, bells, old posts, or anything the weather recognized as useful. Maris's voice came through. "Wynne, stay in your vehicle. Give me any marker." Static. Then Wynne, less polished now. "I passed a stack of culvert pipe. Road edge disappeared. Vehicle slid, but upright. Visibility 0. Dean looked at Nolan. Nolan looked back. The choice was obvious. That did not make it pleasant. Owen's voice came from the chapel radio. "If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I object on behalf of common sense." Maris cut in. "Dean, hold position. County unit is delayed, but moving." "Delayed how long?" No answer. That was answer enough. Vera's bells rang from the chapel tower, small and stubborn. Dean clipped a flare to his belt. "Nolan, can you mark the spur from memory?" Nolan wiped snow from his face. "Enough not to walk into the drainage cut." "Comforting." Kestrel stepped between them, facing the east spur. Dean looked down. "You sure?" The shepherd's sides moved with heavy breaths. Snow clung to her whiskers. She was tired. Not mythic, not endless, just loyal past convenience. Dean crouched and touched 2 fingers to the leather collar above her bell. "Slow," he said. Kestrel blinked once. They found Wynne's SUV 30 minutes later, though time in a whiteout had no manners and might have been 10 or 100. The vehicle sat angled near a shallow drainage cut, front wheels buried, hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow. Wynne opened the door when Dean knocked on the window. For once, his scarf was crooked. His face was bloodless with cold, and something he would likely call irritation if anyone asked. "Holloway," he said. "Wynne." Nolan looped a tow strap around the rear frame while Dean checked the ground. Kestrel stood between the SUV and the road, head low, watching the weather rather than the man. Wynne looked at the bells clipped to Dean's pack, then toward the faint sound coming from the ridge. "You came by the bell route," he said. Dean brushed snow from the strap. "You got another one?" Wynne had no answer. They did not humiliate him. Dean would not have allowed it, even if the weather had. Humiliation was a poor tool. It broke in the hand and cut everybody nearby. They guided Wynne on foot back toward the chapel spur, using rope, reflectors, and the uneven music of the nearest bell cluster. Nolan went first with the light. Dean stayed behind Wynne. Kestrel moved along the side, her bell answering the larger line in small private notes. At one point, Wynne slipped. Dean caught his arm. For a second, the 2 men stood close enough for Dean to see fear stripped clean of polish in Wynne's eyes. Then Wynne regained his balance. "Thank you," he said stiffly. Dean nodded. "Keep walking." By full dark, everyone had been accounted for, not rescued from catastrophe. Not dragged from wreckage, accounted for. In mountain country, that word carried its own quiet holiness. At St. Anselm's, the little stove glowed red. Wet gloves hung along pewbacks. Vera sat in her chair beneath the empty tower, both hands in her lap now, fingers curled from strain. Owen draped his heavy work coat over her shoulders without asking. She did not protest, which told Dean how tired she was. Maris called in the final confirmation from the substation. "All parties safe or sheltered, no injuries reported beyond pride and poor judgment." Owen looked toward Dean. "You'll need a doctor then." Nolan sat on the chapel floor, back against a pew, writing in his notebook with hands that still shook slightly. Wynne stood near the door, silent, snow melting from his expensive coat onto the old wood floor. Kestrel lay at Dean's feet, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. Her little bell rested against her collar, barely moving with each breath. Dean looked out through the chapel window. Beyond the glass, Bell Road was invisible. But from the white dark came small sounds, high bells, low bells, a dented cowbell that deserved legal protection for ugliness alone. Vera's temporary tower chime, pulled now by wind instead of hands. Not one great voice, many imperfect ones. Dean rested one hand lightly on Kestrel's head. Her fur was damp and cold, but beneath it was warmth, real and stubborn. He had spent years thinking silence was safer because silence asked nothing from a man. Tonight, silence had nearly taken the road. The bells had not been grand. They had not been pure. They had not sounded like legend. They had sounded like neighbors. Dean looked at Vera, at Owen, at Nolan writing the truth, at Maris's voice still crackling from the radio, at even Wynne standing quiet by the door. Then he looked back at the white road. Sometimes, he thought, a town did not survive because one great bell remained above it. Sometimes it survived because enough small bells agreed not to be silent. The county hearing was held on a morning so bright it seemed unfair. After the storm, Juniper Ridge lay beneath a hard blue sky, the snowfields glittering as if the night had broken into 1,000 pieces and left them scattered across the valley. Pines stood bent but unbroken. Roofs shone, fence wires flashed silver where the wind had scraped them clean. Pine Hollow looked innocent. That was winter's oldest trick. The county meeting room smelled of wet wool, coffee, copier toner, and nervous patience. Folding chairs had been set in rows, but there were not enough. People stood along the back wall, some with hats in hand, some still wearing snow pants because work had not paused just because history had scheduled itself for 10 o'clock. At the front, the long council table was covered in paper. Harriet Sloane had seen to that. There were Arthur's bell logs, Vera's postal maps, the old county memo, photographs of the weathered Bell Road sign, maintenance invoices, signed statements, Maris Kent's incident notes, Nolan Price's updated survey packet, and printed transcripts from the radio calls during the storm. Harriet had arranged them in labeled stacks with such severe neatness that even the county commissioners seemed afraid to breathe too close to them. Vera Mallory sat in the front row with Arthur's leather mailbag at her feet. Her hands were folded around a small notebook, but Dean could see the stiffness in her fingers from the night she had worked the rope. Kestrel lay beside her chair, chin up, amber eyes watching every movement in the room. The little bell on her collar was silent. Dean stood near the back. He had chosen that spot deliberately. A man could still support a thing from the back of a room. He did not need to sit under the lights like a witness awaiting judgment. Owen Rusk stood next to him, arms crossed, clean flannel buttoned badly at the collar. He had made an effort, which for Owen meant his boots had been scraped before entering, and only one pencil was stuck behind his ear. "You look like you're planning to bolt," Owen said. "I'm standing." "Deer stand before they bolt." Dean looked at him. "You always this comforting?" "I save my best work for funerals and county proceedings, often similar." At the front, Coulter Wynne sat with his attorney and two folders so thin they looked confident. His charcoal suit was perfect. His silver pen rested between two fingers. He looked rested, composed, and expensive. Only Dean, who had held his arm on the white road 2 nights earlier, noticed that Wynne did not look toward the window when the wind struck the glass. Fear, when it had no place to sit, became posture. The chairwoman called the hearing to order. Nolan Price was asked to speak first. He stood with his survey packet in both hands. His reflective jacket was gone, replaced by a navy blazer and pale shirt, but he still looked like a man more comfortable beside a tripod than a microphone. His face was pale, the skin under one eye faintly bruised where wind-driven ice had struck him during the storm. He set his papers down. For a moment, he did not speak. Then he looked at the commissioners, not at Wynne, not at Dean, not at Vera. "My preliminary recommendation was likely closure or restricted seasonal access," Nolan said. "That recommendation has changed." A rustle moved through the room. Wynne's pen stopped turning. Nolan continued, his voice steadier now. based on archival review, field assessment, historical usage documentation, recovered signage, and operational evidence gathered during the January whiteout event, I find that Bell Road has functioned as a winter access route for mail, medical, supply, ranch, and emergency passage across multiple decades. He turned a page. The temporary bell line installed before the storm demonstrated practical value as an orientation aid under whiteout conditions, especially where visual markers and GPS reference were limited or unreliable. I personally confirmed this near Miller Draw. He paused. That pause was not for drama. It was for honesty. I became disoriented during the assessment. I regained the route by following the acoustic sequence installed at the northern turn. Without that sequence, I cannot state with confidence that I would have reached my vehicle safely. The room went very still. Dean saw Nolan's throat move as he swallowed. My revised recommendation is that Bell Road be recognized as a public winter passage and that St. Anselm's Chapel be designated as a support and orientation point, pending structural repair and formal maintenance planning. Nolan sat down. Harriet made one small blue mark on her copy of his report. It sounded like a gavel in Dean's mind. Coulter Wynne rose next. He smiled, but the room no longer leaned toward it. "I appreciate Mr. Price's diligence," Wynne began, "and I am grateful, as we all are, that no one was seriously harmed during the storm." He did not look at Dean when he said it. "I want to be clear. My company has never sought to erase local history. Quite the opposite. We proposed preservation funding, improved infrastructure, new jobs, and a broader tax base. Juniper Ridge cannot live on memory alone." That sentence found willing ears. Dean saw it. Wynne still knew where hunger lived in a room. He went on. "There may be a compromise. We would be willing to finance restoration of the chapel as a heritage landmark, fund a commemorative display, and incorporate the bell motif into the resort identity. We can honor the past while building a viable future." Vera's face did not move, but Kestrel lifted her head. Wynne continued, smooth as snow over thin ice. "Public access need not mean unrestricted access through private development zones. With proper planning, the old road can be symbolically preserved while safer modern routes are designed." A rancher stood before anyone invited him. Tom Brenner removed his hat. "Symbolic road doesn't move feed." A small ripple of agreement followed. Maeve Larkin stood next, her white hair cut close around her face, her hands folded over the back of the chair in front of her. "A symbolic bell doesn't tell a nurse where the ridge turn is when her windshield goes white." Silas Grady rose in the back and said, "A symbolic access route won't get your contractor unstuck when he finds out Wyoming doesn't read brochures." That earned a few laughs. Not many. Enough. Wynne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then Vera stood. Dean felt the room change before she said a word. She did not carry Arthur's bell book this time. She held only one thing, the small tarnished bell from Kestrel's old collar, which she had unfastened before the meeting began. Kestrel sat beside her, bare-collared now, strangely solemn. Vera placed the bell on the table. It made one soft sound against the wood. "I am tired," she said. No one expected that. Dean certainly did not. Vera looked at the commissioners. "I am tired of proving that people mattered because their names were written in pencil instead of typed in a system. I am tired of being called sentimental by men who put fireplaces in drawings and call that vision. I am tired of hearing that memory has no function from people who keep asking our memory to make their resort more charming." Wynne's attorney shifted. Vera did not look at him. "I am not asking you to freeze Juniper Ridge in the past. Arthur would have hated that. He liked working heaters and good tires and anyone who finally learned to use common sense before losing a toe." A few people smiled. I am asking you not to cut the living part out of the past and then sell us the shell." Her hand rested beside the small bell. "This road worked because people worked it. If the county recognizes that, we will keep working it." She sat down. For the first time all morning, Dean saw Wynne look uncertain, not defeated. Uncertain. That was better. Defeat could turn into revenge. Uncertainty sometimes turned into thought, though Dean would not bet a snow shovel on it. The commissioners withdrew for deliberation. People murmured. Coffee was poured. Chairs scraped. Vera remained seated, one hand resting on Kestrel's head. Dean went outside instead. The courthouse steps were bright with snowmelt. Main Street shone under the winter sun. Across the road, someone had hung bells in a shop window after the storm, mismatched little things tied with red yarn. Dean stood there with his hands in his coat pockets. A minute later, Coulter Wynne came out. Dean did not turn. Wynne stopped 2 steps away. For a while, both men looked at the street. "You could have left me on that spur," Wynne said. "Yes." "You didn't." "No." Wynne let out a small breath that was not quite laughter. "Is this where you tell me that proves something about community?" Dean looked at him then. "No." Wynne waited. Dean said, "It proves you were lucky the road you wanted gone still had people on it." The words landed without heat. Wynne looked away first. "I do believe this place needs a future," he said. "So do I." "You don't like mine." "I don't like futures that require everyone else to forget where they stand." For once, Wynne had no immediate reply. The door opened behind them. Maris stepped out, her expression unreadable. "They're ready." The decision took less time to read than it had taken to earn. Bell Road would be recognized as a public winter passage. St. Anselm's Chapel would become the Juniper Ridge Winter Bell Station, a seasonal safety, shelter, and orientation point maintained through a joint agreement between the county and local volunteers. Wynne's development could proceed only with revised access protections. His company would contribute to winter maintenance funds and could not control or obstruct Bell Road. The chapel would not become resort property. The bell would be returned after inspection and repair work. The county would require formal structural evaluation, but not silence. No one cheered at first. The words were too official for joy. Then Silas clapped once, loudly. Elise Brenner joined, then Maeve. Then the room filled with applause, not wild, not theatrical, but steady, like hands warming themselves around a fire. Vera bowed her head. Kestrel pressed against her knee. Dean looked down at his own hands and found that they were shaking. Owen noticed. "Don't get emotional," Owen said. "It'll confuse the paperwork." Dean cleared his throat. "Shut up. There he is." The great bell returned 3 days later. Not in triumph. In a flatbed truck. It came back with inspection tags, a repair list, and 2 men from Hasker Contracting who looked relieved to be delivering instead of removing. Owen supervised the lift with the ferocity of a small-town emperor. Dean worked beside him, replacing hardware, checking braces, fitting new rope, and swearing only when the wind deserved it. Vera watched from below. When the bell finally settled back into the tower, it did not ring. Not yet. Dean wanted everything checked twice, then again, because reverence was no excuse for bad rigging. Later, inside the chapel, Vera handed him a key. It was old, iron, and colder than expected. Dean stared at it. "No." Vera nodded. "Yes?" "I don't run chapels." "It isn't a chapel you're being asked to run. It's a winter station. Bells, generator, lights, radio, road log, marker checks." "That sounds like a job." "It is." "I already have one." Vera looked at him. Dean sighed. "I'm reopening the garage on Saturdays. That is not the same as having a job." "It is close enough to be dangerous." Kestrel stood between them, watching the key as if it were a command. Vera's voice softened, and that was how Dean knew the blow would be accurate. "Arthur cannot hold this place forever. Neither can I. Kestrel is old. I am older. Love does not stay love by gripping until the knuckles crack." Dean looked toward the bell rope. He thought of the shop waiting in silence, of the road under snow, of Nolan's shaking voice on the radio, of Wynne stranded on a road too new to know how to speak, of Arthur's note, blunt as mercy, too proud to thank anyone, still alive, good enough. Dean took the key. "Not alone," he said. Vera smiled. "No, you would be terrible alone." So they made it official in the plainest way possible. Dean Holloway became winter caretaker and mechanic for the Bell Station. Owen took responsibility for tools and repairs, though he claimed responsibility was a rash he had not consented to. Harriet kept the records and wrote rules and sentences sharp enough to cut string. Nolan agreed to inspect markers before each heavy snow period. Maris added the station to the county winter safety plan. Vera kept the honor ledger, where names would be written when the road helped bring someone home. Kestrel chose her own office, which was everywhere. She stayed with Dean most nights, sleeping near the stove at his cabin or under the bench at the reopened garage. Every afternoon, when the weather allowed, she walked with him to Vera's house and sat by the old mailbag while Vera made tea strong enough to frighten weaker cups. She did not replace Arthur. She did not replace the bell. She did not heal Dean as if grief were a machine with one missing bolt. She simply stood between people until they remembered how to step closer. 2 weeks after the storm, the first official ringing took place at St. Anselm's. The morning was clear, clean, and bitter. Snow lay over Juniper Ridge in shining folds. Along Bell Road, the small donated bells remained on their posts, not as a substitute now, but as companions. They caught the breeze now and then, offering small, uneven answers before the great bells spoke. Vera stood by the chapel door with one hand resting on Kestrel's head. Owen was on a ladder adjusting the porch light, even though no one had asked him to. Harriet opened a new ledger on the front pew and wrote the date in blue pencil first, then ink. Maris stood near her cruiser, looking down the road. Nolan checked his compass, then looked embarrassed when he realized Dean had seen him smile. Dean took the bell rope. It felt heavier than he remembered. Or maybe he understood weight differently now. He pulled. The bell moved above him. For one breath, there was only wood, rope, iron, and the held silence of everyone listening. Then the sound rolled out. Deep, clear, not sorrowful, not triumphant, awake. It traveled down the ridge, over the cedar posts, past the little bells, across the road where tires had once lost their way, and found it again. It moved over snow, bright as a promise nobody trusted too easily but wanted to believe. Kestrel lifted her head. The small bell had been tied back to her collar that morning. When she shifted, it answered the tower in one small note. Ling. Dean looked out toward Pine Hollow. Smoke rose from chimneys. Trucks moved slowly along Main Street. Somewhere below, his old garage waited with the bay door unlocked for Saturday. He was not healed. That was too clean a word. But he was no longer only a man who had left. He was someone expected. Someone responsible for a rope, a generator, a radio, a road log, a set of ugly bells, and maybe, if winter was feeling especially dramatic, a few stubborn souls who needed help finding their way. Vera came to stand beside him. "You rang it well," she said. Dean glanced at her. "It's a bell, Vera. It does most of the work." Men say that when they are afraid of being thanked. Dean looked down at Kestrel. Her amber eyes were half closed, her body relaxed against Vera's leg. "Arthur would have complained about the rope angle," Dean said. Vera's smile trembled. "Yes," she said. "Then he would have been pleased." Outside, the little bells along Bell Road stirred in the wind, one after another, small voices answering the great one. Juniper Ridge had not been saved by a secret, not by a miracle, not by one man returning from exile to become a hero carved from winter light. It had been saved by records, weather, stubborn women, practical men, a deputy with a field book, a surveyor brave enough to change his mind, and a German shepherd who remembered the road when people forgot. Dean listened until the last note faded into the bright morning. The road remained. The bell remained. The future, for once, did not require silence. Sometimes the road back to hope does not open with a miracle loud enough for the whole world to hear. Sometimes it begins with one small bell, one faithful dog, one old promise, and a few people willing to remember what still matters. Dean, Vera, Kestrel, and the people of Juniper Ridge remind us that the past should not trap us, but it can guide us. And when we choose to protect what has helped others find their way, we become part of that guiding light, too. Maybe there is a quiet bell in your own life tonight, a memory, a person, a prayer, or a small act of courage calling you back to what is good. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what the last bell of Juniper Ridge meant to you. And if you believe stories of loyalty, grace, and second chances still matter, please subscribe and stay with us. May peace find your home, and may you always hear the small bells of hope when the road ahead turns white.